Unhook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Happy holidays. I think we can say that. We are right in the middle of the holiday season as Jews celebrate Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, which ends on Monday, and Christians prepare to celebrate Christmas, the birth of Christ. But it is also a secular family holiday observed by Christians and non-Christians alike. Tonight on Newsmaker Saturday, we're going to take a deep dive into both traditions. My guests this week on Newsmaker Sunday, Father John Parks from the Catholic Diocese and Rabbi Kahn from Congregation Beth Israel. So, a priest and a rabbi walk into a bar.
That's right. Here we are.
It is like a punchline. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to start with you, Steve, because you obviously Hanukkah ends on Monday, so we'll give you the first crack at it. For Jews, Hanukkah is not a particularly religious holiday, is it?
Well, it's a 8-day holiday that's considered in our calendar a minor holiday, but we really view Judaism as more than a religion, but as a peoplehood. So in the life of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, it's a big deal, especially because of its message.
And Father John, for Christians, this is a big deal.
It's a big deal, yeah. So currently we're in the season of Advent, of course.
Right.
We're celebrating what's called the two comings of Christ. So Jesus coming in history, and then God coming at the end of time of all of his majesty. And so we're sort of preparing for both of them. So of course we'll culminate on the evening of December 24th when we usher in the Christmas season.
Do you worry sometimes that lost in all the commercialism of Christmas is the story behind it?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people celebrate Christmas, and obviously it's a big deal, but why is it? And, you know, a holiday is always connected to a holy day. So when something was a holy day, that turned it into a holiday. And, you know, for Christians, we're celebrating the fact that God became a baby, which is pretty crazy, right? It's an overwhelming thing. So, yeah, you can get caught up in all the commercialism and forget this reality, that God became one of us.
And Steve, when Christians celebrate Christmas, obviously a deep part of their faith, but for Jews, obviously, scripture-wise, there is a divergence of opinion of what's happening here.
Right. It's I don't see it as much of a divergence as here we have two traditions that are rooted in a narrative, and this narrative, this story, has archetypes. And these archetypes, whether they are people who live according to a certain creed or teach a certain message, the archetypes actually aren't that different. Where it diverges is, I guess, historically when
the birth of Christ.
Exactly. And the followers, from the Jewish perspective, when the followers of Christ go in a different direction than the Jewish community. But we sort of start out on the same playing field with the same archetypes and the same story.
Jesus is a Jew.
That's what we understand from history, yes.
Yes. John, for people who are not particularly religious, what would you want them to know why this is so important? This time of year, this holiday, Christmas.
Yeah, I would say the simplest answer would be that God deeply cares about your life. So that God has gotten in the whole of every person. By that I mean he's taken on what you have to give you what he has. So he's kind of taken on a human nature to give you what he has, which is his divine nature. So God is intimately involved in your life. You know, we see the rise of kind of the new atheism in our culture. And I think a lot of people experience what are called like a practical atheism, where like they believe in God, but God is kind of out there. He's not really interested in my life.
This is something you are dealing with every Sunday and every day.
Oh, certainly, certainly. And Christmas says, no, God is intimately involved in your life. He's counted every hair on your head. He knows everything about you. He's intimately concerned with your problems in your life. So it's incredibly good news, right? That God loves me, he cares about me, that the creator of the universe knows me by name.
Steve, you made a point earlier that Judaism is a peoplehood as well as a religion, even as much so.
Sure.
That part of it, maybe Christians, people in the Catholic faith, Methodist, whatever it might be, may not fully understand that component of it.
Sure. It's maybe hard to understand, but if I put it this way, maybe it'll give it some context. The Jewish people are inseparably linked, not only by the story that I was talking about earlier, but by the civilization, if you will, of Judaism that has, for 4,000 years, sort of bound us together. So if something in Israel happens in a Jewish community, Jews in Phoenix, Arizona care deeply about it. Whereas, yeah, if something happens in a Protestant community somewhere, Protestants in the United States may not be as connected to it. So when I say that we're inseparably linked, that's what makes us a peoplehood more than just a religion. It's rituals, it's beliefs, it's commandments, it's culture, but it's the binding through not only the deeds that we do, but the history that we have shared. Mm-hmm. And so, again, for 4,000 years, since the time of Abraham and Sarah, we have been connected by a story as much as anything else.
Let's talk about Hanukkah for a moment. The 8 days, the significance of the 8 days.
Well, it would take me a long time to explain how it got to be 8 days.
Well, I'll give you a starting point. There's some video of the menorah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yes.
So the 8 days there are a couple different interpretations, but without getting into the nitty-gritty, in about the year 500 or 600 of the Common Era, a book was called the Talmud, was written, and the rabbis said, for 8 days you will celebrate the Festival of Lights, this Hanukkah, which means rededication, because the Second Temple was rededicated in Jerusalem years before that. And they believed that there was this miracle that God created, which was there was a cruse of oil that was only meant to last, this oil to burn in the menorah, the candelabra of the Holy Temple, for 1 day, and it lasted 8 days. And so because of that miracle, again, going back to being bound by stories, we're bound by this story, this idea that this light lasted much longer than it was supposed to. And that's why we celebrate 8 nights, because it lasted 8 days.
And for Christians, why the 25th? Because even historically, there's some discussion, some feeling that maybe Jesus was born actually in the summertime. But the 25th has to do something with maybe the winter solstice. Is that possible?
Yeah, so scholars I don't think are unanimous about this. Some think he was probably born during the summer, some on December 25th. But I would say also in ancient pagan culture, there were gods that they worshipped on December 25th. So the idea is Jesus is the God. So now we're going to celebrate his birth on this date. So there is no God now but Jesus. And so the idea is to show he's the one true God, and that's why we're celebrating his feast day on this date.
Can you both talk for a moment about, and John, I'll start with you, young people trying to bring them into the fold, trying to tell the stories, trying to bring them up to speed with the importance of the religion in this day and age where the smartphone is everything, and we seem to be in a bit of a cultural shift here with how we get our information. No question about that. How do you connect?
Yeah, there's a book some years ago called The Crisis of Western Civilization. He thought that if you look at history, the dominant factor of history is religion. Culture comes from a Latin word cultus, meaning worship. So what we worship impacts our culture, which greatly impacts our politics, impacts everything. So the Judeo-Christian tradition has greatly impacted the American tradition. And you could say in some ways we're kind of walking away from that. The question then is that a good thing to do? So I would just invite them to take another look at the gospel message, right? That this is what our culture was built upon. And that the things that flow from it, like human rights, for instance, comes from this idea that each person is made in God's image and likeness, and that protects human rights, which is something we all love. But if we begin to lose that foundation, well, then everything will begin to follow.
Steve, because Judaism is, you're born into this, that doesn't seem to be as much of a problem for Jews as it is for Christians to bring that in, because it's so cultural, it's so familial. That connection seems to be inherent almost.
Well, yes, but I think I would assume you would agree that the family in our society, which is the foundation of civilization, is only, you can be born into Judaism, you can be born and baptized Catholic, but if the family unit is not using the rituals, the stories, the celebrations, even the moment practicing, but more than practicing, living it, then with all the distractions that you mentioned, it becomes almost insurmountable for that story to be a hook or an anchor, and that it feels like the distractions, the social media, the cell phones, the 24/7 cycle of news and the way that we operate has made it very difficult for the family unit to be anchored anywhere, because life is moving so fast, they have nowhere to be anchored, and if they are anchored, well, we hope that it's going to be in their faith tradition. So I think the story is just as profound. I think I love Catholics because they get we share the same value of that story. The stories are different, and granted, we have conflicting truths about these ideas, but this foundation and anchoring in story, in what I call archetypes, seeing ourselves as connected, and then seeing the God within ourselves. It's insurmountable sometimes with the amount of stuff that's going on all the time. And we've become overstimulated, and that makes our jobs even more challenging, but I think a lot more fun as well.
We recently attended a bat mitzvah for twin girls. I could not believe the level of preparation that went into that day. It was remarkable.
But
you
that's
talk about
because,
family involvement. Unbelievable.
Because those girls and their family see themselves as active participants in the ongoing story of the peoplehood, of our people. They see themselves as standing in a place that generations going back thousands of years have stood, and they've made an argument that that is more important than all of these distractions. And then we do a great job preparing them as well.
Right.
But it's not us. It's really them doing all the work. And I think that's why we've both been very committed to working with kids and with teens, is because we know that if we're not planting the seeds there, then we're going to lose that message and that continuity.
Go ahead. Father John, so would the analogy be in the Catholic Church catechism, would that be somewhat the learning that goes into kind of a child growing up and becoming an adult?
Sure. I mean, we have what are called sacraments, of course, which are these encounters with God. And so there's always a preparation for those. At the end of the day, they're ultimately gifts that God gives us, but we want somebody to understand the gift that they're receiving. I'd like to build on a point, though, that the rabbi made.
Yes,
this is
please.
the story. I don't even know if it's a true story, but the story goes that there was a Catholic priest speaking to a Jewish rabbi, and he says, why don't you have a catechism? Because Christians of all denominations have catechisms. Why don't you have a catechism? And he said, we do. It's our calendar. And the idea was if you lived the rhythm of the calendar, you understood intuitively what it meant to be Jewish. And again, we're not ghosts floating around. We're embodied souls. What we do with our bodies is very important, what we would call liturgy in the Catholic Church. And so that's why it's so important. These holidays, like Christmas, it gets it into our bodies. You know, having a creche scene, when I go to church, from the Catholic perspective, you know, we kneel, we stand, we make the sign of the cross. We're not ghosts. We have to get this into our bodies. It has to be a living reality, which starts, of course, in the family.
But don't you feel that the rituals are actually enabling us to purge all of those distractions? It's like really getting yourself outside of that. So it's almost harder to get people in, but once they're there and leave, they feel that sense of God's presence
completely
through community.
Yes.
Right?
I agree with that, and we felt that at this bat mitzvah. It was amazing, the sense of community in that room. It was a great thing to see.
Thank you.
Father John Parks from the Catholic Diocese, Rabbi Stephen Kahn from Congregation Beth Israel, our guests on Newsmaker Sunday, as we're kind of marking the season with two different approaches that all lead to the same place. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker Saturday. Back on Newsmaker Saturday, Father John Parks from the Catholic Diocese, Rabbi Stephen Kahn from Congregation Beth Israel. We're talking about the holidays. Now, let's talk for a moment about blended families. This is always a challenge. Who wants to start?
Good question.
Well played, sir. Yeah. Go ahead, unless you need me to.
This is really about respect.
So we call it the December dilemma, right? So you've got families where someone who was raised Jewish is married to someone who was not raised Jewish. Now that person could be practicing another religion or not. It is hard to counsel families on how to honor and respect traditions that they grew up with, yet I think we would both probably recommend to people, as far as their home goes, to pick a primary religion, pick something to be anchored in. Easier when your kids are young not to have to define any kinds of parameters around that, but as they get older, it can get very confusing to have different dogma and different rituals and different messages. So again, we want to be inclusive and we want to embrace the diversity, but I feel strongly that families need to anchor their household, their home, in one of the narratives, in one of the stories, in one of the traditions.
Because it's confusing for children.
And then, we have lots of kids who celebrate Christmas with grandparents, because their grandparents didn't convert to Judaism, or with other family. And that seems to be more of a win-win. But it's it causes people from Thanksgiving until New Year's a lot of anxiety.
Father John, do you recommend if a couple is they're from different faiths and they're getting married, do you both recommend that they should probably do a little bit of counseling with their respective religions and try to figure this thing out before?
Well, I appreciate you bringing this up simply because I sometimes forget that for a lot of people, the holidays are more stressful.
Oh, yeah.
People come back
no
into town,
doubt.
tension in family. And I'm reminded that in Matthew's gospel, it starts off with the genealogy of Jesus. And these are not all solid citizens. There's some shady people in this genealogy. And that's great news.
We have absolutely no dysfunction in our story.
That's right. So, and this is the lineage Jesus came from, which I think is really good news that God knows of our mess. And I think a lot of times when we see a mess, God sees an adventure. And so that God is in that.
I love that.
Even when the holiday times, when aunt's home and uncle's home and there's some division there and there probably needs to be some forgiveness there, well, God wants to bring that about. As far as, the blended family, the relationship, to your question, when couples come, relationships have to be based on something. And one of my favorite authors named G.K. Chesterton, he used to say, what we really believe, we teach to children. And so to build on a point
it's
Rabbi
our better
made,
selves. It's the embodiment of our better selves, right?
Yeah, and religion answers all the most fundamental questions. Where did I come from? Where am I going? How ought I to act? What's the best way to live? And that has to be a foundation. And for kids, it could be confusing if they have two different foundations. And so obviously, if a couple wants to get married, I think, well, you gotta explore these because you need to have a common foundation.
Misconceptions. What would you want Christians to know about Hanukkah that they may not get?
I think the story of pursuing religious freedom is a very Jewish story. And what we recognize in this holiday is not just the rededication of the Holy Temple that stood in Jerusalem, but the idea that xenophobia is wrong, that religious persecution as a result of human beings who deify themselves in order to say their idea is better than anyone else, and anyone who doesn't do what I say is no longer given the rights to exist, to practice their religion, that these are very common threads in Catholicism and in Judaism, and in many aspects, parts of Christianity and Islam and other religions. So I think that the sense of religious persecution of people who not only want to practice their religion in the way that they were raised, but the ability to do so in safety and security in a society, I think that we need each other a lot more than we think that we do. And so I would hope people would walk away with a sense that Jews are actually marking time, which is what you were talking about before, that we're marking this time as a time to dedicate ourselves to that mission and be together in that effort.
Something I've noticed in the past probably 20 years, schools now give days off for Rosh Hashanah. That didn't used to happen as much. The public schools have really kind of embraced this idea. You have to be pleased about that, right? Because this gets into acceptance, inclusion, and all of those things you just talked about.
Look, our society it seems like we keep postponing inevitabilities where religion and state get mixed up, and they're really not supposed to. And I think that this was an affirmation that not only do the Jews exist, and we're only 2% of the population in the country, but
Is that right?
Yeah.
2%?
A little bit less, actually, than 2%. But that our holidays, our holiest of holidays, count, and that those kids should feel like they count. When I grew up, it was punitive if you missed a day of school in a public school on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It seemed like teachers would schedule tests or big papers were due, and now what they're saying is, you're Jewish, and we affirm that part of you as a society, and I think that's incredibly important.
Father John, same question. What would be the misconceptions that you would want to clear up about maybe Christmas, maybe about Christianity, maybe about the Catholic Church? Is there anything you'd like to get out there?
Yeah, I'd say ultimately that it's good news. So it's an invitation into a life with having a relationship with God. And something that the rabbi said, Pope Benedict once said that faith can only be proposed, never imposed. So it's always a proposal of a way of life. But Christians, we believe that God has already done something for us, which is, he's died on the cross for our sins, he's risen to new life, and he's offering us new life through him. So all of the hard work he's done for us.
Yeah.
And so faith is about responding to that invitation to live in relationship with him.
How much dialogue goes on between the different faiths in this community? Is there a lot of meeting and sitting down and trying to make sure those bridges are built and intact?
I think so. I mean, I think that at the foundation there is. We did a memorial service for the Pittsburgh shooting a few weeks ago, and not only did we have a number of rabbis, but we had a member of the Catholic, not from the diocese, but from a Catholic church. We had an imam, we had a Sikh leader. I think that we need to learn how to come together, not only when there's tragedy, but to learn from each other. I mean, only good things can happen when we come together, and to your credit, to bring us in to have these conversations is part of the solution. It
started as a barroom punchline, the priest and the rabbi.
That's right.
But we thought,
I still haven't been served a cocktail.
We thought, we're going to actually do it. We're going to bring you guys in. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and these are good conversations.
They are important conversations to have. Let's get back to kind of how people who are not particularly religious view these times. Christmas, you start getting a lot of Santa Claus. The ads start. We talked about this at the beginning of the program, but I want to touch back on this. Bringing people back into the importance of this time when it's just crass commercialism.
Yes.
It's a tough one. And the kids get caught up in it.
Yes.
Is it tough to kind of reach them and say, hang on for a second, Santa comes a little later, let's talk?
Yeah, as you say that, I'm reminded of, Jesus was born in a manger, and why a manger? And the answer is because it was available. It made room for him. And so there's an old saying that he who wins the rat race is still a rat. So we can get caught up in all of that, all that materialism. The question is does that really satisfy our hearts? Is that really enough? And so I think for all of us, we asked ourselves, the answer would be no. Question, okay, well then how do I kind of facilitate this relationship with God? So God is not trying to make it hard to find him. And so again, God was born in a manger because a manger, in a sense, gave him permission to be there while there was no room at the inn. So that's the question, is will we make room for God in this season, right? That he would be born again in our hearts.
And you feel that even in this day and age, children can be reached, but that probably starts fundamentally in the home, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Parents making those boundaries and just, one of my favorite quotes on raising children, which is ironic because I'm never going to have any, but is that children have often failed to listen to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. And so if parents want their kids to have faith, then they have to see it modeled in them. Do your kids catch you praying? Do your kids catch you going to church, going to confession? Then they see, oh, mom and dad, they take this seriously. They're not required to be perfect parents. They're required to be holy ones. So that's when they fall. They ask for forgiveness. They try to keep walking, going on the journey.
It reminds me of something my dad said, kids pay attention to what you do, not what you say. And it's very true.
That's right.
Steve, I'll give you the last word. What would you like people to take away from a program like this as we head to break?
Well, I think that one of the things as we mark the passing of President Bush this week, I'm
glad you brought that up.
One of the sort of common denominators in the service, in the funeral service, was this idea of how critical faith was to the late president and late First Lady. And one of the things that was discussed today was how they prayed every single night before they went to sleep together. I mean, they were madly in love with each other. It's a beautiful thing to see. And they're exemplars of so many great ideas, not just as religious people, but as Americans. I think that idea that everybody in this chaotic world should try to take some time, whether it's 8 days. I mean, it's 8 days out of 365. It's 1 day out of 3. We have to do this every day. It has to be a regular activity. If we learn from the Bushes, it's how anchoring and incredible that can be and meaningful.
I'm glad you both came in today. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best during the season, Rabbi Steve, Father John, thank you both. We appreciate it on Newsmaker Saturday. Back in a moment. Thank you. Thanks again to Father John and Rabbi Stephen Kahn, and we appreciate you tuning in on Newsmaker Saturday. We'll see you again next week. Please reach out on social media at John Hook Fox 10 Phoenix.